The soft hum of the laptop filled the room as Carson worked late into the night, the glow of the screen casting faint shadows across the walls. The clock on the desk read 11:42 p.m. Madeline had gone to bed hours earlier, brushing a kiss on his forehead and murmuring something about being exhausted. It was a scene they had repeated countless times during their 6 years of marriage, but tonight it felt different. Carson's fingers paused over his keyboard. The unease that had been nagging at him for weeks now felt suffocating. He glanced toward the bedroom door, left slightly ajar. The faint sound of Madeline's steady breathing reached his ears, but it did little to calm him. His gaze fell on Madeline's laptop lying closed on the corner of the desk. She had been oddly protective of it lately, even snapping at him earlier that week when he had shifted it to make room for a stack of papers. "It's just work stuff," she had said sharply, her tone defensive. Carson had let it go then, but the exchange kept replaying in his mind. Now, alone in the quiet of the house, his curiosity clawed at him. His rational mind told him to let it go. Maybe she had confidential work documents. Maybe she was planning a surprise for him. Maybe he was overthinking, but his gut said otherwise. He reached for the laptop and opened it, wincing at the faint chime as the screen lit up. Madeline's password was no mystery. They had set their devices up together. He typed it in with trembling fingers. "You're being ridiculous," Carson muttered under his breath. But he couldn't shake the knot tightening in his chest. The desktop appeared, cluttered with folders and documents. For a moment, he hesitated, his fingers hovering over the trackpad. What was he even looking for? He scanned the folder names, most of them mundane: taxes, vacation pics, work notes. But one folder caught his attention. Memories. It was tucked into a corner of the screen, as if deliberately placed to be overlooked. The title seemed innocent enough, but something about it felt off. His pulse quickened as he double-clicked it. The folder opened to reveal a grid of thumbnails. At first glance, it seemed harmless, images of trips they had taken together, family gatherings, and holidays. But then he scrolled down. His breath hitched. The thumbnails changed. The photos became more intimate, more graphic. Carson's hand hovered over the trackpad as his stomach turned. In each image, Madeline was with someone else, someone all too familiar. His brother, Andrew. "Jesus Christ," Carson whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding in his ears. He clicked one of the photos, and it expanded on the screen. Madeline and Andrew were entwined in a way that left no room for doubt. The timestamp in the corner showed it had been taken 6 months ago, around the time Madeline had started acting distant. Carson scrolled through more images, each one more damning than the last. His chest felt tight, his breathing shallow. Then he noticed the files attached to the photos' chat logs. He clicked one. "That was incredible. You make me feel alive in a way he never could," Madeline had written. "I'm just glad we don't have to sneak around forever," Andrew had replied. The bile rose in Carson's throat as he clicked through more messages, each one peeling back layers of lies he hadn't even known existed. But the final message, buried deep in the folder, stopped him cold. "That loser won't come back from his next work trip," Andrew had written. "The hitman's all set. He'll make it look like a robbery gone wrong. Once he's gone, we'll split the insurance and be together. We'll be f***ing rich." Carson stared at the screen, the words burning into his brain. His hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. For a moment, he couldn't move, couldn't think. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating. He shoved the chair back, standing abruptly. The noise echoed in the silence, but Madeline's steady breathing from the bedroom didn't falter. She was asleep, oblivious to the chaos unraveling just feet away. Carson paced the room, his mind racing. How had it come to this? The woman he had loved, the brother he had trusted, they had been plotting to end his life. And for what? Money? Lust? His vision blurred as anger and betrayal roared through him. He sank back into the chair, his head in his hands. Images of Madeline's laughter from earlier that evening flashed through his mind. She had stood by the stove, joking about trying a new recipe, her smile warm and inviting. It had been a lie. Every moment, every word, it had all been a performance. Carson forced himself to breathe deeply, his mind sharpening. This wasn't the time to collapse. If they were planning to kill him, he had to act. Now, his eyes returned to the screen. He took screenshots of everything, the photos, the messages, the timestamps. He uploaded them to a secure cloud folder, his fingers moving quickly despite the tremor in his hands. Madeline stirred in the bedroom, and Carson froze. He listened for a moment, his ears straining. The sound of her breathing evened out again, and he exhaled. Sliding the laptop shut, he stood and walked to the kitchen, his movements quiet and deliberate. He poured himself a glass of water, his mind running through the steps he needed to take. He had to move his assets, contact a lawyer, and most importantly, ensure his safety. As he sipped the water, a new clarity settled over him. The betrayal was staggering, but it wouldn't break him. Not yet. If Madeline and Andrew thought they could destroy him, they had underestimated the fight in him. Setting the glass down, Carson turned off the lights and headed to bed. Tomorrow, everything would change. But tonight, he let the darkness envelop him, knowing it would be the last time he faced it unprepared. Carson stood at the counter, pouring himself a cup of coffee. His hand trembled, spilling a few drops onto the counter. He grabbed a paper towel and wiped it up, his jaw tightening as he tried to focus. The images from the night before flashed in his mind again, vivid and sickening. Madeline entered the kitchen, her slippers padding softly on the tiled floor. She yawned, her hair tied up in a loose bun, and leaned against the counter. Her phone was in her hand as usual. Carson glanced at her, forcing his face into a neutral expression. "Morning," she said with a sleepy smile. "You're up early?" "Couldn't sleep," Carson replied, turning back to his coffee. His voice sounded steady enough, but inside, he felt like a taut wire, ready to snap. Madeline poured herself a glass of orange juice and started scrolling through her phone. "Work stuff keeping you up?" "Something like that." He took a sip of coffee, keeping his eyes on the mud. He could feel her watching him. "You seem off," Madeline said, putting her phone down. "You okay, babe?" Carson met her gaze. Her concern looked genuine, but he knew better now. "Yeah," he said, his tone even. "Just didn't sleep well." Madeline walked over and placed a kiss on his cheek. Her lips were soft, warm, yet the gesture felt hollow. "Maybe we should plan a weekend away after your trip," she suggested. "Just the two of us. We could use some time together." The irony of her words almost made him laugh. "Yes, sounds good," Carson said, forcing a small smile. Madeline smiled back, seemingly satisfied. She picked up her purse and checked her reflection in the hallway mirror. "I'm running late. See you tonight?" "Sure," Carson replied, his voice distant. He watched as she grabbed her keys and headed for the door. "Love you," she called over her shoulder. "You too," Carson said, though the words felt like ash in his mouth. The door clicked shut, and he stood still, listening to her car start and drive away. Once the sound faded, he exhaled a shaky breath. His heart raced as he reached into the kitchen drawer and pulled out a small GPS tracker. Madeline's purse had been hanging on the back of a chair while she got ready, and he'd slipped it in without her noticing. Now, he had a way to monitor her every move. Carson spent the next few hours in a haze of action. First, he called his lawyer, Diane Carter, a no-nonsense woman he had worked with before on some minor business matters. This time, the stakes were much higher. "Diane, I need to move all my assets into a private trust." "Immediately," he said when she answered. "Carson, good morning." "That's a big step. What's going on?" Diane asked. "I can't explain right now. Just know it's urgent, and it needs to be airtight. Can you help me?" Diane hesitated for a moment, then her tone turned professional. "Of course. I'll get everything prepared. Do you want me to come to your office?" "No. Send me the documents electronically. I'll sign and return them." "Understood. I'll have them ready by this afternoon." "Thanks, Diane. I owe you one." Carson hung up and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. The knot in his stomach loosened slightly. At least now, Madeline and Andrew wouldn't get their hands on his money. By mid-afternoon, Carson was at his office, finalizing the paperwork Diane had sent. His phone buzzed with a notification from the tracker app. Madeline's location showed she was at a coffee shop on the other side of town. Curious, Carson opened the app's live feed and watched as the dot remained stationary for several minutes. He texted her, "How's work?" A reply came almost instantly. Busy. You. Same, Carson responded, his fingers tightening around the phone. He knew she was lying, but he needed to keep her oblivious to his suspicions. Later that evening, Madeline returned home, cheerful and talkative as usual. Work was insane today, she said as she unpacked a takeout bag. I thought I'd grab dinner for us, since you've been working so hard. Carson nodded, masking his thoughts as he set the table. Thanks. Smells good. They ate in relative silence, the clinking of utensils punctuating the tension Carson felt but refused to show. Madeline chatted about her day, mentioning a client meeting that Carson now knew was a fabrication. Every word she spoke felt like another drop of acid on his already raw emotions. You've been quiet tonight, Madeline said, looking at him with what seemed like genuine concern. Are you sure you're okay? Just tired, Carson replied, keeping his tone neutral. Madeline reached across the table and squeezed his hand. Well, get some rest tonight, okay? I worry about you. Carson stared at her hand on his, the touch that had once comforted him, now feeling alien. He nodded, forcing a small smile. I will. That night, as Madeline showered, Carson sat in his office, reviewing the data from the tracker. Madeline had made 3 stops that weren't related to her work. One was a coffee shop. Another was a hotel. The third was a residential address he didn't recognize. He jotted down the locations, his mind working overtime. When Madeline emerged from the shower, wrapped in a towel, she gave him a warm smile. Coming to bed? In a minute, Carson said, closing his laptop. Just finishing something up? She nodded and disappeared into the bedroom. Carson sat in the quiet of the office, staring at the closed laptop. His plan was taking shape, but every step he took deepened the ache of betrayal. He couldn't let his emotions cloud his judgment now. He had to stay sharp, calculated. As he finally made his way to bed, Madeline was already asleep, her breathing soft and steady. Carson lay beside her, staring at the ceiling. Her presence next to him felt like a cruel joke, but he knew it wouldn't last much longer. The storm was coming, and he would make sure it left her life in ruins. Carson left the house before dawn. The suitcase by the door wasn't fully packed. It was deliberate, a breadcrumb to fuel Madeline's confusion. He wanted her to think he'd left in a rush, leaving her to panic and scramble. With the GPS tracker still in her purse and his lawyer's instructions executed, the next phase of his plan was in motion. By the time Madeline woke up, the house was eerily quiet. She stretched, glancing at Carson's side of the bed, and frowned. The covers were tossed aside, but he was gone. Padding into the kitchen, she saw his coffee mug still on the counter, half empty, and his suitcase by the door. Something was wrong. Carson, she called out, her voice echoing through the empty house. No answer. She grabbed her phone and dialed his number. It rang once before going to voicemail. She tried again with the same result. Madeline bit her lip, anxiety creeping in. Carson always let her know when he left for an early meeting. This wasn't like him. Her phone buzzed in her hand. She snatched it up, but it wasn't Carson, it was Andrew. She hesitated before answering. Hey, she said, trying to sound casual. Morning. Andrew's voice was light. You alone? Madeline glanced around, lowering her voice. Yeah, I think so. Carson's gone. His suitcase is here, but he's not answering his phone. There was a pause before Andrew responded, a hint of amusement in his tone. Really? Interesting. Interesting? It's weird. What if he knows? Madeline asked, her voice rising slightly. If he knew, do you think he'd just disappear? He's probably sulking somewhere, Andrew replied. You know how he is? Madeline didn't respond, pacing the kitchen instead. Her free hand fidgeted with the edge of her robe. What if he found something? What if? Relax, Andrew interrupted. I'll come over. We'll figure it out. An hour later, Andrew was sprawled on Carson's favorite armchair, his legs casually crossed. Madeline paced the living room, her nerves fraying with each unanswered call to Carson. He's just gone, she muttered, running a hand through her hair. No, nothing. Andrew watched her with a smirk. Maybe he finally grew a spine and left you. Not funny, Andrew, Madeline snapped. If he's gone, this whole thing falls apart. No insurance, no. Calm down. Andrew sat up, leaning forward. If he's gone, it's better for us. No messy divorce. No awkward questions. Maybe the idiot made it easy for us. Madeline shook her head, her pacing increasing. What if he comes back? What if he knows what we've been planning? Andrew's smirk deepened. And does what, Madeline? Cry about it? Carson's always been a coward. If he knew, he wouldn't have left quietly. He'd either confront us or run to the police. And since we haven't seen either, Madeline stopped pacing and stared at Andrew. You're sure? Positive. He leaned back again, his confidence oozing. Besides, I've got a plan. If he does come back, we'll handle it. Madeline hesitated, her fingers curling into fists. I don't like this. Andrew stood and walked over to her, placing his hands on her shoulders. Trust me. You've trusted me this far, haven't you? She nodded reluctantly. I just didn't expect him to vanish like this. It's unsettling. Andrew chuckled. He probably finally realized he's in over his head. Let's not waste time worrying about him. Meanwhile, Carson sat in a small rental car parked 2 streets over. His laptop sat open on the passenger seat, the GPS tracker app displaying Madeline's exact location. She hadn't left the house since Andrew arrived. Carson adjusted the rearview mirror, his reflection showing a man transformed. Not broken, but hardened. His phone buzzed. It was Diane. Everything's done, she said when he answered. Your assets are secure, and the divorce papers are ready. Do you want them served today? Yes, Carson said, his tone cold. And include the evidence packet. Understood. Anything else? Carson paused, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. Not yet. I'll let you know. He hung up and turned his attention back to the house. Through the window, he could see shadows moving, Madeline pacing, Andrew lounging. They looked comfortable, complacent. It infuriated him, but he pushed the anger down. He couldn't afford to lose control. Back inside, Madeline finally sank onto the couch, her nerves frayed. What if this is all a trap, she muttered. Andrew rolled his eyes. A trap? From Carson? The guy who gets queasy over horror movies? Be serious. Madeline didn't respond, her eyes darting to the suitcase by the door. Something about it felt staged, as if it was meant to be a signal. But to whom? Andrew stood and stretched. Look, I've got to go. I'll check in later. In the meantime, stop freaking out. You're going to blow this if you don't pull yourself together. Madeline glared at him, but said nothing as he left, the door clicking shut behind him. Outside, Andrew didn't notice Carson's car as he walked to his own. Carson watched him drive away, his jaw tightening. His brother's nonchalance only solidified Carson's resolve. Carson glanced at his phone. The divorce papers would be delivered within hours. He imagined Madeline's reaction, shock, confusion, and then the crushing realization that her plan had been exposed. It was just the beginning. As Carson pulled away from the curb, a new plan began to form in his mind. He wasn't going to just disappear. He was going to dismantle their lives piece by piece. By the time he was done, Madeline and Andrew would wish they had never crossed him. Carson sat in a dimly lit corner of a small cafe, the aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingling with the faint sound of jazz playing in the background. His laptop screen glowed softly, displaying the live feed from Madeline's tracker. The app showed her at a nearby hotel again. He clenched his jaw as he clicked through the locations she had visited over the past few days. Each meeting with Andrew, each deviation from her routine, was cataloged and time-stamped. Refill, a waitress asked, gesturing to his empty coffee cup. Carson glanced up and nodded. Yeah, thanks. As she walked away, he returned his focus to the laptop. Madeline and Andrew weren't being subtle. Their confidence in his supposed ignorance was both infuriating and useful. They met frequently, their conversations likely filled with laughter and smug reassurances that Carson was none the wiser. His phone vibrated. A notification from the tracker. Madeline had left the hotel and was heading back home. Perfect timing, Carson thought. He had an appointment with the police in less than an hour. At the police station, Carson sat across from Detective Harris, a middle-aged man with a skeptical expression. The small room was plain, the air slightly stale, and the hum of fluorescent lights filled the silence as Carson began explaining. So, let me get this straight, Harris said, leaning back in his chair. You're saying your wife and your brother not only had an affair, but also hired a hitman to kill you? Carson nodded, sliding a flash drive across the table. Everything you need to verify my story is on that drive. Photos, messages, their plans, everything. Harris raised an eyebrow as he plugged the drive into his laptop. As the contents loaded, his skeptical demeanor shifted. Carson sat in silence, watching the detective's eyes widen as he scrolled through the files. This, Harris said, pausing on a chat log. This is solid. These messages alone are damning. There's more, Carson said, his voice steady. The hitman they hired, I have his name and some details from their conversations. I tracked him through their messages. Harris looked up sharply. You tracked him? I had to, Carson replied. You don't just sit on your hands when you find out someone's planning to kill you. The detective nodded slowly. All right, we'll bring this guy in and see if your story checks out. If it does, you'll be hearing from us. Hours later, Carson's phone buzzed with a call from Harris. We got him, Harris said. The hitman confessed to the whole thing. He was hesitant to follow through and said he'd been second-guessing the job since he agreed to it. He named your wife and brother as the ones who hired him. Carson let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. What now? We need them to incriminate themselves further. If they think their plan is still in motion, they'll get sloppy. That's where you come in? Carson's brow furrowed. What do you need me to do? Disappear, Harris said. Let them think you're gone, just as they planned. Keep up the facade, and we'll handle the rest. Carson hesitated. The idea of vanishing, even temporarily, felt risky. But it was the perfect way to ensure Madeline and Andrew dug their own graves. All right, he said finally. I'll do it. Back at his temporary apartment, Carson worked late into the night, meticulously laying the groundwork for his next move. He monitored Madeline's tracker and recorded every suspicious location she visited. The police were watching too, but Carson couldn't rely on them alone. He had to ensure nothing slipped through the cracks. He created fake emails and messages, planting seeds of doubt and confusion. Using a burner phone, he sent Madeline cryptic texts from an anonymous number. What would Carson think of this? He imagined the panic on her face as she read the messages. It wasn't about tormenting her, yet, but about keeping her on edge, forcing her to make mistakes. Meanwhile, Madeline and Andrew were oblivious to the tightening noose. At her kitchen table, Madeline sat across from Andrew, her face pale and her fingers fidgeting with her coffee cup. It's been days, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. What if someone's onto us? Andrew rolled his eyes, leaning back in his chair. No one's onto anything. Relax. Carson's probably halfway across the country, crying into a beer somewhere. You're too calm about this, Madeline snapped. What if he comes back? And what's he going to do? Write us a strongly worded letter. Andrew scoffed. He's gone, Madeline. The plan worked. Madeline didn't respond, her gaze dropping to her cup. She wanted to believe Andrew, but something didn't feel right. Carson watched the scene unfold through the GPS data and surveillance footage he had rigged near the house. Their arrogance was staggering. Andrew, ever the smug opportunist, lounged comfortably in Carson's home as if it was already his. Madeline, though nervous, still clung to the belief that Carson was out of the picture. His phone buzzed again. Another message from Detective Harris. We got them on wiretaps. They're slipping up. Keep laying low. Carson smirked. The trap was working better than he'd anticipated. Days turned into a week, and the pressure on Madeline and Andrew began to mount. Carson continued feeding the police updates and kept tabs on every move they made. He crafted scenarios in his mind, imagining how it would all come crashing down. Late one night, as he sat in his darkened apartment, he recorded a video message. It wasn't for the authorities or his lawyer. It was for Madeline and Andrew. A parting gift for when the dust settled. Madeline, Andrew, he began, staring into the camera. You thought you could outsmart me. You thought I wouldn't fight back. But you underestimated me. And now, you'll pay the price. He saved the video and leaned back, the weight of betrayal still heavy on his shoulders, but tempered by a growing sense of justice. The trap was set, and the endgame was near. The living room was eerily silent, save for the ticking of the wall clock. Madeline sat on the edge of the couch, staring at her phone. Her calls to Andrew had gone unanswered for 2 days. Her once perfect plan was unraveling, and she was beginning to feel the consequences of their betrayal. The knock on the door startled her. Madeline hesitated, her nerves fraying. For a moment, she thought it might be Andrew, finally coming to reassure her. But when she opened the door, 2 uniformed police officers stood on her porch. "Mrs. Carter?" the taller officer asked. Madeline nodded, her throat dry. "Yes. We have a warrant to search the premises. Please step aside." "What? Why?" Her words faltered as they stepped in, one of them handing her a piece of paper. "We're conducting an investigation related to a criminal conspiracy," the officer said, his tone firm but polite. Madeline's heart raced. "There must be a mistake. I don't know anything about." "Please stand over there, ma'am," the other officer interrupted, pointing toward the kitchen. Madeline obeyed, frozen as the officers began searching her house. They moved with precision, confiscating laptops, phones, and even rifling through paperwork in the home office. Her mind spun. Who tipped them off? Did Andrew slip up? "Can I call someone?" Madeline asked, her voice trembling. "You're not under arrest at this time," one officer replied. "But you're free to call whoever you need." Madeline shakily dialed Andrew's number again. It rang, then went to voicemail. Frustrated, she slammed the phone down on the counter. Where was he? Hours later, the house was empty again, but it no longer felt like her home. Madeline sat in the middle of the floor, staring at the empty spaces where her devices used to be. She had no idea what the police had found or how much trouble she was in. The uncertainty gnawed at her. The doorbell rang, breaking her spiral of anxious thoughts. She scrambled to her feet and opened the door, finding only an envelope on the doormat. There was no one in sight. She picked up the envelope and closed the door, her hands shaking as she tore it open. Inside was a single sheet of paper, neatly folded. She opened it, her eyes scanning the handwritten words. "Madeline, I know everything. The photos, the messages, the plan to kill me. I've left you with nothing, not a single dollar, not a shred of dignity. Enjoy the life you thought you'd have without me. You'll soon see how loyal Andrew is when the heat is on. Goodbye forever. Carson." The letter slipped from Madeline's trembling hands and fluttered to the floor. She stumbled backward, her legs giving out beneath her as she collapsed onto the couch. Her mind raced as the weight of Carson's words sank in. "No," she whispered. "This can't be happening." She grabbed her phone and called Andrew again. Voicemail. Desperation clawed at her. She tried 3 more times, each call ending the same way. On the 4th attempt, she screamed into the phone. "Andrew, answer me. The police were here. They know. Carson knows. Where are you?" She hung up and hurled the phone across the room, watching as it bounced off the wall and landed with a thud. Tears streamed down her face as she curled up on the couch, her mind replaying the betrayal Carson had uncovered. Meanwhile, Andrew was holed up in a dingy motel on the outskirts of town. His nerves were shot, and his hands shook as he poured whiskey into a plastic cup. His phone buzzed on the nightstand, Madeline's name lighting up the screen again. He let it ring. "Crazy bitch," he muttered, taking a swig of the whiskey. He wasn't stupid. The police raid was too close for comfort, and he wasn't about to go down for Madeline's mess. He had already started withdrawing his share of their savings and planning an escape. Madeline could fend for herself. As he finished his drink, there was a knock at the door. His heart leaped into his throat. He set the cup down and approached the door cautiously. "Who is it?" he called out. "Room service," a voice replied. Andrew frowned. He hadn't ordered anything. He opened the door a crack, only to see 2 officers standing there. "Andrew Carter?" one of them asked. Andrew's face paled. "Yeah. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder. Step outside, please." Back at the house, Madeline was startled by the sound of tires screeching outside. She jumped to her feet and peered through the window. A black car she didn't recognize was parked at the curb. The driver's side door opened, and a man stepped out. Her breath caught in her throat when she recognized Carson. He looked different, calm, composed, and utterly indifferent to her. She flung the door open and stepped outside. "Carson, what the hell is going on? Why are the police? Carson held up a hand, silencing her. Save it, Madeline. I know everything. Her face crumbled. I can explain. Please, just let me. You don't get to explain, Carson said, his voice cold and cutting. I gave you everything, Madeline. I trusted you. And you repaid me by sleeping with my brother and plotting to have me killed. Tears streamed down her face. I made a mistake. Please, Carson. I was confused. You weren't confused when you sent those messages. You weren't confused when you took those photos. You knew exactly what you were doing. Madeline fell to her knees on the front porch, sobbing. Please, I'll do anything. Just don't leave me like this. Carson stared at her, unmoved. I already did. He turned and walked back to his car, leaving Madeline crumpled on the porch, her cries echoing into the night. As he drove away, he felt an odd sense of closure. He had reclaimed his life, and Madeline and Andrew were finally facing the consequences of their actions. Andrew sat in the cold, stark interrogation room, his hands cuffed to the metal table. A fluorescent light buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow on his sweaty face. Detective Harris sat across from him, flipping through a folder filled with evidence. You're in deep, Andrew, Harris said, his tone measured. We've got enough to put you away for a long time. Conspiracy to commit murder isn't something we take lightly. Andrew leaned back in his chair, trying to mask his fear with bravado. Look, you've got this all wrong. It wasn't my idea. I didn't even want to go through with it. Harris raised an eyebrow. So, it wasn't your idea to hire a hitman to kill your brother and split his insurance money with his wife. Andrew squirmed. It was her idea. Madeline was the one who planned everything. She hated Carson, said he was holding her back, ruining her life. I just went along with it. Harris smirked, leaning forward. You just went along with it? That's your defense? I've got proof, Andrew blurted out. Messages, emails, she sent them all. I can give you everything. Just cut me a deal, all right? Harris leaned back, feigning disinterest. We'll see. Keep talking. Across town, Madeline sat in her lawyer's office, her face pale and drawn. The once confident woman who had schemed with Andrew now looked like a shadow of herself. Her lawyer, a stern woman in her 50s, laid out the situation bluntly. The evidence against you is overwhelming, the lawyer said. They've got text messages, photos, financial records. And now Andrew is throwing you under the bus. Madeline's head snapped up. What? He's claiming you were the mastermind, that he was just a pawn in your plan. He's offered to cooperate in exchange for leniency. Madeline's hands trembled. That bastard. He was just as involved as I was. More even, he's lying to save himself. Her lawyer sighed. That may be, but the prosecutors are more likely to believe him. Right now, your best option is to strike a deal first. If you can provide something they don't already have, it might reduce your sentence. Madeline buried her face in her hands. I don't have anything. Everything they want, they already know. The lawyer's expression softened slightly. Then you need to prepare yourself. This isn't going away. In jail, Andrew's swagger quickly evaporated. The other inmates weren't kind to him, especially after hearing rumors of his betrayal against his own brother. One evening, as Andrew sat on the edge of his bunk, another inmate approached him, a tall, burly man with a scar running down his cheek. So, you're the guy who tried to off his own brother? The man asked, his voice low and menacing. Andrew stiffened. You don't know what you're talking about. The man chuckled darkly. Oh, I know plenty. People like you. Cowards who stab their family in the back. They don't last long in here. Andrew didn't respond, but the message was clear. He spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, the weight of his choices pressing down on him like a boulder. Madeline, meanwhile, faced a different kind of prison. Released on bail, she returned to an empty house, stripped of its warmth and life. The community had turned against her. Friends she had once confided in avoided her calls. Neighbors whispered behind her back, their pitying or disgusted glances a constant reminder of her disgrace. One afternoon, Madeline ventured to the grocery store, hoping to blend in and escape the suffocating loneliness of her home. As she turned a corner in the produce aisle, she came face to face with an old friend, Beth. Beth, hi, Madeline said, forcing a smile. Beth's expression hardened. Madeline, I was hoping we could talk, Madeline began. I know things look bad, but Beth cut her off. Bad? Madeline, you plotted to kill your husband. And with his brother, no less. What kind of person does that? I made a mistake, Madeline said, her voice cracking. I don't know what I was thinking. Beth shook her head. Save it. People trusted you, Madeline. Carson trusted you. And look what you did to him. Without another word, Beth turned and walked away, leaving Madeline standing alone in the aisle. The humiliation stung more than she expected. The courtroom hearings were a spectacle, drawing attention from local media. Both Madeline and Andrew sat stone-faced as the prosecution laid out their case. Photos, texts, and financial records painted a damning picture of their conspiracy. The jury looked on with a mix of disbelief and disgust. When Andrew took the stand, his betrayal of Madeline was complete. She came up with everything, he testified. The hitman, the insurance money, all of it. I was stupid enough to go along with it. Madeline glared at him from the defense table, her nails digging into her palms. She wanted to shout, to expose his lies, but her lawyer's firm grip on her arm kept her seated. When it was Madeline's turn, she tried to play the victim. Andrew manipulated me, she said, her voice trembling. He made me believe we had no other option. I regret everything, but the evidence spoke louder than her words. The jury wasn't swayed. The sentences came swiftly. Andrew received 15 years, his cooperation earning him a slight reduction. Madeline, deemed the instigator by the court, was handed 20. As the judge read her sentence, Madeline's vision blurred, her mind struggling to process the reality of her fall from grace. As they were led out of the courtroom in cuffs, Madeline and Andrew exchanged one last look. There was no love or loyalty left, only resentment and blame. In his new life far away, Carson watched the news coverage of the trial with a sense of closure. He didn't smile or gloat. There was no joy in seeing the people he had once trusted destroyed. But there was satisfaction in knowing justice had been served. He turned off the TV and stepped outside, breathing in the fresh air. For the first time in months, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. The life he had built was gone, but a new one awaited him, free from the shadows of betrayal. The park was alive with the colors of fall, golden leaves drifting lazily to the ground, children laughing in the distance, and the faint sound of a saxophone played by a street performer near the fountain. Carson sat on a bench, the warmth of the autumn sun on his face. For the first time in years, he felt something resembling peace. Beside him sat Elena, her brown hair swept up in a casual ponytail, her soft scarf fluttering in the breeze. She glanced at Carson as he sipped his coffee, his eyes lost in thought. "What are you thinking about?" Elena asked, breaking the comfortable silence between them. Carson turned to her, the ghost of a smile on his lips. "How strange life is. A year ago, I thought my world had ended. And now, here I am, sitting in a park with someone who actually makes me want to try again." Elena smiled, a mix of warmth and understanding. "That's a good thing, isn't it?" "It is," Carson said, though his voice carried a hint of hesitation. Elena noticed. "But," he chuckled softly, shaking his head, "it's not that simple. After everything that happened, trusting someone, anyone, feels like walking a tightrope without a safety net." Elena nodded, her expression serious now. "I get that. After my divorce, I felt the same way. My ex he wasn't who I thought he was. It took me a long time to stop blaming myself for not seeing it sooner." Carson studied her face, noting the way her eyes softened when she spoke of her past. "How did you do it?" "Move forward." She shrugged, looking out at the park. "Time helped, but it wasn't just that. I had to remind myself that what he did says more about him than it does about me, and that I deserve happiness, even if it takes a while to find." He nodded slowly, her words sinking in. "It sounds simple when you put it like that, but living it feels like a whole different game." "It is," she admitted. "But you don't have to do it alone." Carson looked at her, his gaze lingering. "Do you think you'll ever trust again?" Her smile was bittersweet. "I think I already am. With you." Their first meeting had been unremarkable in the best way. A few months ago, Carson had reluctantly joined a support group at the suggestion of his therapist. The group met in the basement of a community center, a circle of strangers sharing stories of heartbreak and betrayal. Elena had been there too, her voice steady as she recounted her own struggles. Carson had been struck by her honesty. She didn't sugarcoat her pain, but didn't let it define her either. After the meeting, they'd exchanged polite words over coffee, discovering a shared love for photography and long walks. From there, a tentative friendship blossomed, built on mutual respect and a cautious willingness to open up. They started meeting outside the group, first for coffee, then for walks in the park. Over time, those walks turned into dinners, and dinners turned into something deeper. Do you ever regret it? Elena asked now, pulling Carson from his thoughts. Regret what? Leaving everything behind. Starting over. Carson thought about it, the question heavy yet liberating. Not for a second. Staying in that situation, living with lies and betrayal, it would have destroyed me. Walking away was the hardest thing I've ever done, but it was also the best. Elena reached out, her hand brushing his. I think you're braver than you realize. Carson looked at her hand, then back at her. I don't know about brave. Stubborn, maybe. Angry, definitely. But brave? That's a stretch. She squeezed his hand gently. You survived. You rebuilt. And you're sitting here, trying again. That's brave in my book. He laughed softly, the sound surprising him. You make it sound easy. Of course it's not easy, Elena said. But nothing worth having ever is. Their conversation drifted to lighter topics, movies they loved, the quirks of their pets, the best coffee spots in the city. As they talked, Carson felt the walls he'd built around himself start to crumble, piece by cautious piece. At one point, Elena pulled out her phone, scrolling through photos. I took this last weekend, she said, showing him a shot of a sunrise over a misty lake. I thought it might be nice to use as a screensaver or something. Carson studied the photo, impressed. You took this? It's incredible. She blushed slightly. It's just a hobby. Nothing professional. You have an eye for it, he said earnestly. It's beautiful. Thanks. She looked at him, her eyes searching. Do you think you'll ever take photos again? You mentioned you used to love it. He hesitated. Photography had been a passion of his before everything fell apart. His camera had gathered dust ever since. Maybe. I don't know. It feels like I'd be reopening a part of myself I'm not ready to face yet. Elena nodded, her expression thoughtful. Maybe that's exactly why you should. Her words hung in the air, challenging yet comforting. Carson didn't respond, but the idea planted itself in his mind. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the park, Carson realized how much he looked forward to these moments with Elena. She didn't push, didn't demand more than he could give. But she offered something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Before they left, Elena turned to him, her expression serious. You know, Carson, I don't expect you to have everything figured out. I don't even expect you to trust me completely yet. But I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. Carson looked at her, his chest tightening with emotion he hadn't let himself feel in years. Thank you, he said softly. That means more than you know. They walked away from the park together, leaves crunching underfoot. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Carson didn't feel like he was looking over his shoulder. Instead, he found himself looking forward. The rain drummed steadily against the window as Carson sat at his kitchen table, a cup of tea steaming in front of him. He'd just come back from a walk with Elena, their laughter still echoing in his mind. His life, though scarred, had found its rhythm again. He was healing. A soft thud interrupted his thoughts. He glanced toward the door and noticed an envelope that had been slipped through the mail slot. Frowning, he stood, his steps cautious as he approached. The envelope was plain and unmarked, the paper slightly damp from the rain. Carson opened it, unfolding a handwritten letter. The familiarity of the handwriting froze him for a moment. It was Madeline's. Carson, I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but please, I need you to read this. I need you to know the truth. I've lost everything. Andrew betrayed me. The police have taken everything, and I can barely breathe under the weight of what I've done. But I swear to you, I didn't plan this alone. Andrew manipulated me. He fed my insecurities, twisted my love for you into resentment, and made me believe there was no other way. I know that doesn't excuse what I did. Nothing can. But I loved you once, Carson. Maybe part of me still does. I'm not asking for a second chance. I don't deserve it. All I'm asking for is forgiveness, so I can try to find a way to live with myself. Please, Carson, even if you never respond, just know I'm sorry. Madeline. Carson read the letter twice, his grip tightening on the edges of the paper. He exhaled slowly, leaning back against the counter. A swirl of emotions, anger, disbelief, pity, coursed through him, but the strongest was resolve. Not my problem anymore, he muttered, folding the letter in half and setting it aside. Later that evening, Elena noticed his uncharacteristic silence. They were on the couch, a movie playing in the background, but Carson hadn't touched his popcorn. Something on your mind? Elena asked, placing a hand gently on his knee. Carson hesitated before pulling the letter from the side table and handing it to her. Madeline wrote to me. Here. Elena read it quietly, her expression neutral. When she finished, she placed it on the coffee table and turned to him. How does it make you feel? She asked. Carson let out a short, humorless laugh. That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I feel nothing, honestly. No anger. No sympathy. Just nothing. That's not nothing, Elena said softly. That's closure. Carson considered her words and realized she was right. The pain that had once consumed him had dulled. Madeline's desperate words couldn't reopen wounds that had finally begun to heal. Days later, the letter remained on the coffee table, untouched. Carson debated throwing it away, but something held him back. Not sentimentality, but the realization that it represented a chapter he had truly closed. He shared the situation with his therapist during their next session. She says she was manipulated, Carson explained. That Andrew twisted her mind, fed her insecurities. Maybe that's true. Maybe it's not. But it doesn't change what she did. The therapist nodded thoughtfully. You're right. Understanding someone's reasons doesn't always mean forgiving them or letting them back into your life. I don't want to forgive her, Carson admitted. Does that make me a bad person? The therapist shook her head. Not at all. Forgiveness is for you, not them. If you feel at peace without it, that's what matters. Carson left the session feeling lighter, as though a weight he hadn't realized he was carrying had been lifted. Madeline's letter was her final attempt to regain control, but Carson didn't respond. He didn't need to. Her suffering, the loss of everything she'd once held dear, was punishment enough. She had made her choices, and now she had to live with them. Meanwhile, Carson's life flourished in ways he hadn't anticipated. One evening, as he and Elena walked hand in hand through the park, a light drizzle began to fall, dappling the path with tiny, glittering drops. Elena laughed, pulling her jacket tighter around her. We always seem to get caught in the rain. Carson smiled, pulling her closer. Maybe it's the universe's way of reminding us to slow down. She tilted her head, studying him. You've changed since we met. There's a lightness about you now, like you've let go of something heavy. I have, Carson said simply. For a long time, I was carrying anger. At Madeline, at Andrew, at myself. I thought I'd never trust again, never feel normal again. But meeting you, you've shown me there's more to life than what I lost. Elena's gaze softened. You've given me just as much. It's not easy finding someone who understands what it's like to rebuild from nothing. Carson stopped walking, turning to face her. That's why we work. We're not pretending we don't have scars. We're just learning how to live with them. As the rain began to fall harder, they found shelter under a large oak tree. Elena leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. Do you think this us could be something more? Carson didn't hesitate. I think it already is. That night, as he lay in bed, Carson reflected on the journey that had brought him here. Madeline's betrayal had nearly destroyed him, but in its aftermath, he had rebuilt himself, stronger, wiser, and with a clearer sense of what he wanted in life. His phone buzzed on the nightstand. A message from Elena. Good night, Carson. Thank you for being you. He smiled, typing a quick reply before setting the phone down. Good night, Elena. Thank you for giving me hope. For the first time in years, Carson drifted off to sleep without the weight of the past bearing down on him. The storm that had once engulfed his life had passed, leaving behind a clear sky and the promise of brighter days ahead.